Three, two, one.
Chris, it's great to have you on. Gubernatorial candidate for the state of Utah for the Democrats. We're really excited to have you on and tell us a little bit about why you're running and what your policy positions are. I mean, we're really, really grateful that you took the time to. We're a small podcast and we're only been doing this a couple months, but we're really happy to have you on.
Well, hey, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be with you and excited to help you out with your podcast. And I'm also excited to share a little bit more about my message and my campaign. And, it's not that hard to do. So I'm happy to spend the time. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure. So do you mind telling us just, about why you're running, who you are as a person, what's important to you?
Sure. Well, I care a lot about Utah. My roots in Utah are pretty deep. They go back a long ways. My great-great-grandfather led a wagon train of pioneers to the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. He was the first public school superintendent, was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and he also was the first chairman of Zions Bank. I don't know where all the money went because I was born in West Valley City and was raised in a single parent household. My mom was disabled, and we really struggled to get by when I was young. Oftentimes had very limited income and struggled to make ends meet. Got my first job when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and worked my way through college at the University of Utah. There was a really pivotal moment in my life where I took a job as a telephone bill collector for a payday loan company. For those of you that don't know about payday loan companies, they make very, very high interest rate loans. And I remember listening to the stories of suffering from people who were really struggling to get by, couldn't afford the roof over their heads or access to health care. And I'd have to tell them, gosh, you got to make a payment on this loan or we're gonna sue you and garnish your wages. It was about that time in my life that I decided I wanted to dedicate my life to public service. Eventually won a scholarship to go to law school, and have been trying to spend my life ever since lifting people up, whether that's as a teacher. I'm a law professor at the University of Utah, or as a practicing attorney. I worked in the Obama administration at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, trying to make sure that home mortgage loans and credit cards and other financial products are safe and work for people. And I also worked at the Department of Defense, trying to make sure that we're protecting our military service members from tricks and traps and financial products as well. I'm excited to be running for governor because I want to take that same spirit of public service, trying to lift up ordinary working families and bring that to Utah state government. I feel like Utah government too often is being designed to help the privileged insiders, party elites, and we need to refocus on making sure that government and our businesses are working for the benefit of ordinary families all across the state. So that's why I'm running for governor. I want to lift up and serve the people of Utah.
That's awesome. That's so cool. You can really tell even just from the little bit that I've talked to you that you really care about the people of Utah and I really got why you were running for governor. I wanted to know a little bit about, Utah's a traditionally red state, Republican, and you're running on the Democratic ticket. What do you hope to change? How do you hope to maybe make inroads into politics in Utah as a Democrat in a traditionally Republican state?
Well, thanks, Henry. You're right. For the past several decades, we have been very very Republican, but it hasn't always been that way. When I was a kid, Cal Rampton and Scott Matheson Sr. were Democratic governors for many years, and those were good years in the state of Utah. Also, around the Great Depression, we had a whole series of Democratic governors. And so things change from time to time. And I really do think that we are approaching a real changing moment in our society. I believe that the Republican Party has been drifting for many people further and further away from our core Utah values. President Trump, some people like him, some people don't, but I think that most Utahns agree that he's not a very solid role model for Utah's children. He doesn't have a very good track record of speaking truthfully, hasn't always treated his family members well, and he's unkind to others. Those are not Utah values. And what's more, he's also not conservative. He has not been managing the government's budget acceptably. We now have the largest inflation-adjusted forecasted budget deficit each year since at the height of the Second World War, and we don't really seem to have much of a plan in place to get it back under control. Continuing to have massive tax cuts for the very most wealthy people in our society, and the largest, most successful corporations often aren't paying their fair share, while ordinary working people across the country are still shelling out lots in taxes, and likely are going to be bearing the burden of those taxes in the coming years. That's not a conservative government. That's not Utah-style politics. And frankly, I'm the only major candidate for governor in the 2020 election, both on the Republican side throughout the primaries or now, that is not that's willing to speak up and actually speak some truth about where the president is leading us. So I do think that many Utahns are open to change, and I think that we see some of those same kind of problems that are happening on a smaller scale here in Utah. I think we need a change, and I'm excited to be providing an alternative, and I'm hoping that it's going to resonate with some of the voters.
Sure. So if you don't mind, I want to hone in a little bit on that economic policy. So Utah under Republican leadership has seen tremendous economic growth. It's a great state to open a small business. We're very welcoming to small businesses. As a Democrat, do you plan to continue along some of those conservative values? How do you plan on continuing that economic growth while making sure that the middle class is protected?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first off, I'm a big fan of and a champion of small business. Part of the way that I've chosen to try to lift people up is by being a business law professor, and I teach the commercial law class at the University of Utah, and try to train people to be ready to deal with all of the challenges that are there in representing and building small businesses. And so some of the values that I have, I think that we need to try to have is a light touch on regulation. That doesn't mean that we don't need rules of the road, safety, protection of property rights. We need all of those things, and we've been doing a pretty good job of that in the state of Utah. I also think, generally speaking, we want to try to have low taxes to try to encourage and foster growth. So I'm there with the state of Utah on trying to facilitate businesses, and I'm going to be there just as much as my opponent is, I believe. But how can we try to nurture and facilitate the middle and the working classes? Well, first off, I think that we have not done a great job at making sure we're open to allowing collective bargaining. I believe that historically Democrats and unions have been very good for the working class, and they also can be good for businesses too. But there's nothing to be afraid of about that. That doesn't mean that they always get everything right, but if you look at across the world, which countries have the overall best job growth and income and well-being for middle and lower middle income families, it's places, generally speaking, where they have some collective bargaining and some union representation. If you're going to look out for the little guy, you need to be open to that. I also think that it's time for us to modernize our minimum wage law. We still have a minimum wage that's in the $7 range. When the minimum wage was first passed in inflation-adjusted dollars, that was about $22, $25 in modern value. I'm not so sure we want to go that high. Maybe that's a bit too much. And if we are going to change that, we need to do it gradually and have it phased in, especially when we're in an economic crisis. But is it such an unreasonable thing for Utah to raise that minimum wage up to $12, maybe $15? Lots of other cities and states around the country have done that. And it's actually good for growth because it puts a little bit more money back in the pockets of workers, and they turn around and start spending that in local businesses. It can lift all boats. I think that's a positive development. It's something I'd want to focus on. I also think, go ahead, jump on in there.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'll let you finish your point. I was just going to ask about, while we're on the subject of economics, right now you kind of mentioned that we're in the middle of one of the, biggest economic crises in, probably our lifetimes, if not a lot longer than that. How would you, once you're governor, how would you work to kind of help people get through this, make it out to the other side of this recession caused by coronavirus?
It's one of the most important questions right now. It's something I take very seriously. So a couple of core principles. First off, I'm going to be listening to public health experts and making sure we're doing everything that we can to get this virus under control. Part of the challenge here is that our economy can't be healthy until people are healthy. Part of the reason our economy is struggling to come back is because many people are afraid that if they go to that restaurant, if they go to the theater, if they get out and shop and start engaging in the same kind of business as usual, that they're going to get sick and maybe they're going to die, or maybe they're just going to have permanent lung damage or heart disease, or maybe even brain damage, which is many people have been suffering from the coronavirus. And remember, even though our numbers have gone down a bit, there's nothing that's preventing them from surging back. I'm very worried because I've been hearing from both the coronavirus experts that I've been relying on directly, and also from what I'm reading from experts from around the world. We still have the potential for exponential growth, especially now that it's getting a little bit cooler. Kids are going back to school. Some people are starting to get a little bit lax with the masks. I'm very concerned that we are not through with this crisis yet. We could see another wave. Many more people could die, and it could also impact our economy even more because a lot of the federal relief programs are starting to expire. So what do we need to do? First off, I believe that we need to have a statewide mask mandate. I know that some people are uncomfortable with that because they view it as infringing on their liberty. I believe in liberty. I believe in freedom as much as the next guy. I'm a patriot. I care about our freedoms. But, we always in a society have to accept some limitations on that. People can't drive down the freeway at 200 miles an hour. And even with respect to how we present our bodies, it's not legal for you to walk around without your pants on at the store. We also have to accept temporarily, with some reasonable exceptions, during a viral epidemic, wearing a mask, because it's not just about your freedom, it's about whether or not you unintentionally could infect other people with the virus and cause serious damage to them, and also could unintentionally damage other people's businesses and property because we can't go and shop and travel and do business safely. So we need a mask mandate. That's a real distinction between me and my opponent. Second, economically, I think we need to do more to try to get our economy back on track. One step I think we have not taken as much as we should is doing bonding, issuing bonds, especially the rock bottom low interest rates that we have right now. We could be borrowing some money to invest in shovel-ready infrastructure projects, whether that's water infrastructure development, green energy, solar power, geothermal power, or also rural broadband internet, something that could really help facilitate economic development in rural areas. That could create jobs and spark our economy, which is starting to really suffer right now. I also think we need to do more to make sure we're leveraging federal relief programs, making sure that small businesses are getting the help they need to take advantage of them. And also, we need to make sure that we're working with both tenants and landlords to try to stop evictions that could be coming down the road. There's currently an eviction moratorium at the federal level that's being put in place, but I'm concerned that it's just punting this down the road to the election, and that after there's going to be a big balloon payment that many people who are renting are going to be facing, and we could have a tidal wave of evictions coming right after the election. It's another example, in my view, of the president not engaging in conservative and responsible management, but not just the federal budget, but setting a lot of renters up to really be facing a crisis in their own personal finances. So just a handful of things that I think that we need to be doing a better job at with respect to the coronavirus crisis.
So one thing I did want to touch on and ask you about, on the federal level, we're seeing an inability of the Republicans and the Democrats to come together for another wave of coronavirus relief. As a Democratic governor, it's very likely that you would have a Republican Senate and a Republican House in the House legislature. Probable. How do you plan on reaching out to the other side of the aisle and ensuring that Utahns are protected and their needs come first before your party's?
It's a great question. One of the things, I spent a lot of time working in Washington, and one of the things that I find most distressing about that is the poisonous partisan division that we see back there. It's very difficult to get people to work together across party lines. So how would I do a better job of that here in the state of Utah? Well, we don't know if Congress is going to flip. It's probably pretty unlikely that Democrats are going to manage to regain control of the state of Utah, House of Representatives, or the state Senate. So I agree with you about that. How am I going to work? I'm going to do it politely. I'm going to do it focusing on the issues, focusing on working across party lines, teamwork, coalition building, but also recognizing that I have, if I win this election, I'll have a mandate to be, persistent in trying to negotiate and fight for the interests of ordinary Utahns. I'm certainly not going to roll over and do everything that they necessarily want, but I am going to listen and cooperate. So that's how I'm going to do it. Courtesy, teamwork, professionalism, competence, focusing on data and issues.
That's refreshing given who is president in Washington right now. I think that'll be a good direction for Utah. I want to pivot a little bit, and I think you brought it up a little bit before when you were talking about clean energy. But I mean, Utah, we all live here, and in the winter we know that the air just gets so bad. And I know on your website, looking through your issues, you touched a little bit about how you want to help to clean up the environment in Utah, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. That's a great question. I believe my core values are that we need to act as responsible stewards of the natural environment and the resources that we have around us. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to all go, eat only granola and never drive a car. I confess I still drive a pickup truck, and I like it because my whole family fits in it, and I love to go skiing and camping and that sort of thing. But I am realistic that we need to start making some changes. I need to do that in my own life, and across the state, we need to do that. I'm really hoping to invest in an electric car the next time around, and we need to be doing similar things at the state level. Here are some things that we can do to make progress. First off, Tier 3 gasoline is a new type of gasoline that has lower sulfur emissions. We've been making some progress in getting that introduced in some gas stations around the state, but we've got to push for much faster adoption of low sulfur Tier 3 gasoline. That will help in the winters you mentioned, where we have fine particulate matter emissions that gunk up the air. But we also have really serious air pollution problems in the summer. It's harder to see it though, because it's not as dense, but the ozone pollution could be just as damaging for our lungs. In the winter, it tends to be particulate matter. In the summer, it tends to be ozone pollution. So we need to just decrease the overall carbon dioxide fossil fuel burning. So how can we do that? I think that we need to look for incentives to try to quickly transition our commercial, government, and residential vehicle fleet into plug-in hybrid and electric vehicles. In Norway, we have a lot of ancestors in this state from Norway. They're transitioning their entire body of vehicles to electric vehicles in the coming year. I don't know that we're going to be as quick about that, but we need to do everything that we can to start steering our vehicle purchasing for new vehicles to those electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles. And so that's second. Third, I think that we've got to do more to try to decrease the emissions that are coming from point sources or from factories. One of the best ways to do that is to start building more and more rooftop solar power. And not just the solar power cells themselves, but also storage that's distributed throughout the state. So one of the challenges with solar power is that it's only lighting things up when the sun's shining, but oftentimes in the evening, we also in the night we need that as well. So we need to start building in batteries into our homes and our businesses and government facilities all across the state. And one of the things I'm really excited to do, we have all these public schools in our state. All those public schools have these big pristine roofs and a lot of space available. We should be transitioning to build solar power facilities on all of those public schools and other government buildings, and leading residences and other businesses to do the same thing. And in addition, we should also be looking to build commercial solar power plants. We're one of the hottest, driest states in the country. We have a lot of open space out there in rural communities that need jobs. We can power a lot of the Wasatch Front by having solar power power facilities in some of the outlying areas. Just one example, Tooele, just over the Ochre Mountains, has a lot of open space out there. They need jobs out there, a lot of sunshine, and it's not very far from growing communities just over the mountains. We should be focusing on building solar power plants there. One more I'll add to wind power, but also geothermal energy. We have the third highest geothermal energy reserves in the country here in the state of Utah. It's very consistent and reliable source of power because the core of the earth is hot 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year. A little bit more expensive, but the costs are coming down. That's the kind of thing that we need to start focusing on to try to decrease some of the pollution that we are seeing in the country, and then or in the state. We also need to be reforming to make sure that the kinds of buildings that we're building minimize fossil fuel emissions, and we need to be transitioning away from gasoline-powered lawnmowers and some of the other sources of emission. Some people are surprised to find out that one dirty lawnmower can cause as much pollution as 10 cars in some use patterns. So we've got to start focusing on electric engines instead of internal combustion engines wherever we possibly can. And it's going to be even more important. Our population is growing rapidly. In the coming decades, we're going to have millions more people along the Wasatch Front, and they're all going to be polluting. If we don't get this under control, it's going to really decrease the quality of life.
Thanks, Chris. Hey, I just wanted to touch on, as I'm sure you know, Bernie Sanders won the Democratic primary for the state of Utah. Joe Biden obviously won the nomination. Do you feel that your views are more in line with Bernie Sanders, who won Utah, or the Democratic nominee in Joe Biden?
Well, one of the challenges of running as a Democrat here in the state of Utah is that the Democratic Party itself is really quite liberal in the state, voted for Bernie, but the general electorate as a whole is much, much more conservative. So it's a little bit like, skating while you're doing the splits to try to keep the coalition together. So here, I don't know that I have a comparison about that. I'm more interested in focusing on issues than drawing analogies between politicians that are currently out there. What I can say is that I appreciate Bernie Sanders' passion and energy trying to advocate for the state of Vermont and his relentless, pursuit of a better, more just society. Everyone that you talk to believes that Bernie Sanders is sincere and a decent man, and I'm proud that he's a member of our party. That being said, I also think that Joe Biden is a great guy. He doesn't stoop to some of the name calling, and he's managed to be in public life for generations now, and overcame terrible tragedies in his background, where his wife and his daughter died in a tragic car accident, and then his son, Beau Biden, who I had a chance to meet and work with on a case many years ago, was a great guy, Beau Biden. It must have been just crushing for Vice President Biden to watch his son, who was such a war hero and a veteran, the Attorney General of Delaware, pass away as a young man from brain cancer. Joe Biden has transcended all of that and has never had a major scandal where he's acted with impropriety or dishonesty in his entire life. Compare and contrast that to the President of the United States, who seems to have scandals coming out weekly. Many of them, for most politicians, would be career-ending. Joe Biden has never had, and I'm not saying he's perfect, I'm not saying you agree with everything that he's done, but he's been a good civil servant that's a good role model for our kids and for business and for government across the state. So who am I closest with? I don't know. What I do believe is that the state of Utah is a bit more conservative than Bernie Sanders, and if I'm elected governor, the people should get a leader that's consistent and acts with their values. And so I'm going to be trying to chart a moderate middle course because I believe that's what the people of Utah by and large want. They need somebody that's more like a Scott Matheson Sr. or Cal Rampton Democrat who was family values, business friendly, protected Utah lands and interests from the federal government, and tried to build coalitions through teamwork and compassion. That's the kind of governor that I would be.
Sure. So if you don't mind me just following up, I think one issue that's particularly important to the liberal wing of Utah's base is healthcare. Do you mind just talking a little bit about your healthcare plan and where that falls in line with your competitor?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, it's one of the things I'm most excited to talk about. So I'm really glad that you asked it. Right now, in 2016, the people of Utah passed a ballot measure that took the federal government up on its offer to provide more federal funding to expand Medicaid to reach more low-income Utahns, and overruled the state legislature in expanding Medicaid, which is a part of the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare. Of course, Obamacare was Romney Care before it was Obamacare, back when it was based on the plan that Senator Romney helped spearhead when he was the governor of Massachusetts. I don't think that that's a perfect plan. I think there's some real challenges in that, but I do think that it's expanded healthcare for a lot of people, and the voters of Utah have ratified and adopted into law a version of that. But I was very disappointed when the Cox-Herbert administration and the state legislature rewrote several provisions in that Medicaid expansion ballot measure. Ultimately, those didn't work out. It's currently the law of the state, but that doesn't have to be that way. Come January, or maybe the next January after that, there's nothing that stops the state legislature from unfunding the Medicaid expansion ballot measure adopted by a majority of Utahns. So the first plank in my plan is that if I'm elected, I will fight to ensure that that Medicaid expansion continues to be funded by the state legislature as the voters of Utah already approved. That's not just a Democrat thing. That's a Democrat and Republican. It's a majority Utah position that I will support. Now, contrast that with my competitor. Lieutenant Governor Cox is currently publicly in support of a lawsuit that's being brought by the state of Utah in the name of the Utah voters that voted for Medicaid expansion to invalidate the Affordable Care Act in the Supreme Court of the United States. So a majority of voters voted to expand Medicaid, but nonetheless, my opponent is attempting to undo in the court system that Medicaid expansion initiative. Now, that's not consistent with core Utah values. We know that because of the election. I'm going to fight to expand healthcare, to decrease costs, and to try to provide more and more people with the access to healthcare that they need. I'm not so sure that my opponent is going in the same direction. He seems to be leaving things to the completely free market, where too many people are being left behind.
Yeah, that's an awesome answer. I mean, I think both of us are very similar in our views on that as to you. That's always something that's bothered me a little bit about Utah politics, is the idea that there can be something that the people vote for, something like Prop 2, and then after it gets voted for by the people, can be changed, tweaked, so that it's not in the form that people voted for. What are your thoughts? And I mean, specifically Prop 2, since that's the one I'm kind of thinking about as an example of this. What are your thoughts on that system and how maybe you could change that as governor?
It's very troubling to me. And right now, the voters of the state of Utah have a choice to make. In 2016, they passed 3 ballot measures by a majority vote. The Medicaid expansion we already talked about, Proposition 2, which legalized medical marijuana under the supervision of a physician for people who have a legitimate medical condition and need that care. And then third, a better legislative redistricting process to stop and fight gerrymandering. All 3 of those were passed by partisan votes. But all 3 of those ballot measures, the state legislature and the Herbert Cox administration undermined those ballot measures by watering them down, rewriting them, substituting provisions. They put a bunch of red tape and bureaucracy in the medical marijuana that has made it more difficult for especially rural patients to get the medical marijuana that their physicians are prescribing. That's not okay. We're talking about people who are suffering from serious diseases, things like epilepsy, cancer patients, people with multiple sclerosis, a debilitating neurological disease. If their physicians think that they should get that treatment, then the state legislature is wrong to erect additional barriers and hurdles to try to make that more difficult for that to take place. And then on the legislative redistricting initiative, kudos to the state of Utah for saying that we don't, even though most Utahns lean red, lean Republican, I accept that. I embrace that. That's part of our culture. But kudos to them for saying, you know what, even though we feel that way, we want fair legislative districts districts to make sure that minority citizens, Democrats, people in cities and in suburbs and in the rural areas of Utah all get a fair shake in the way that we draw our legislative boundaries. Instead of just going with that, the state legislature and the Herbert Cox administration eliminated the partisan symmetry test, which tried to make sure that the boundaries were drawn in as bipartisan a way as possible. Also, eliminated the requirement that the state legislature take an up or down vote on the maps that would be drawn by the redistricting commission, and then also allowed a second redistricting commission to be a competing redistricting commission to be staffed by the state legislature. These are significant changes that I think significantly undermine the bill. I don't accept that. I'm going to fight against that. If the public votes for a ballot measure, you can count on me to accept the public's will, listen to the voters, and fight for their interests. That's not the same with my opponent, who's a nice guy, but he's not out there for ordinary people across the state. Instead, he's listening to privileged party insiders and elites that are guiding the state legislature to ignore the will of the public.
Thanks, Chris. So let's say I am a middle-class voter in the state of Utah. I have voted Republican, which I haven't, but let's say, just for a hypothetical, I've voted Republican my entire life. The economy has been good in Utah. I've been doing well. Let's say I have a small business. My small business has been doing well. Why would I change my vote for you in this coming election?
Well, we already talked about a great reason. First off, I'm willing to listen to the public. It's not as though, if I'm elected governor, we'll have a radical change in the direction of the government. Instead, what you'll have is a lot of the same kind of things we've had before, but it's going to be a little bit more focused on the public. It's going to be, my government administration will focus on making sure that the government is run well. We're still going to facilitate and encourage small businesses, but we're going to do it by listening to the public on ballot measures. Here's another thing that I'd like to mention. In the last legislative session, the state legislature voted to nearly triple the food taxes that your family would have to pay when they go to the grocery store. That's not what the public wanted. There was an overwhelming backlash against that. And the public initiated a ballot referendum to try to invalidate that expansion of the food tax. And they managed to do so for now. But I'll have you note that my opponent, the Herbert Cox administration, supported and signed into law a bill that would have increased those food taxes by nearly 3 times. I'm never going to support those food taxes. I want to keep, I want a fair tax system that makes sure that the lowest income and moderate income people who are struggling to get by, that they have the lightest tax burden, and that as you get more and more wealth, to whom more is given, a little bit more needs to be expected. And it's not just something I made up. That's coming from the Bible, is where I'm quoting from there, or nearly quoting from. So that's one difference. I'm going to be looking out for the ordinary pocketbook issues that are facing families like you're talking about. And second, I agree that the Utah economy has been doing pretty well, but it's not quite as rosy a picture as you paint. We have in the state, in Salt Lake City, homeless camps all across the city that are growing, and there are many people who are struggling to make ends meet, working 2, 3 jobs even, and still don't have access to health care. We have one of the higher rates of people who don't have health care in our state. Our unemployment rate is relatively low, but many of those people are working jobs where they're just barely making enough money to keep a roof over their head and don't have any reliable access to healthcare. We also have historically had one of the highest bankruptcy rates in the country, and we're not getting some of the high quality services that we would normally expect from our government. We have the lowest per pupil funding in our public schools of any state in the country, and that's been a problem for decades. I believe that we need to be investing in our children, making sure that they have the resources that they need to learn. 1 out of 4 children in 4th grade in our state hasn't learned how to read. That's unacceptable. I'm going to be fighting to make sure that families like you're talking about have good, high-quality schools for their children, and that we're planning for the future and making sure we have a labor force that's going to continue to create not just jobs, but high-paying living wage jobs that allow the working and middle classes to get ahead.
I was actually just about to go to education, so that's awesome that you brought it up. Just to clarify a little bit on the education, I think everyone agrees that we need to improve. It's not acceptable that Utah spends some of the lowest amounts in the nation on education. Where would you propose that we get the money for those changes to increase the funding to our public schools?
Great. So one of the things that the state legislature has been quite good at is making sure they have a balanced budget by keeping spending low. They carefully scrutinize most of the dollars that are going out the door. Sometimes they make mistakes. I think we saw some of that in the administration of the coronavirus funds. But one place where they have been not very good at it at all is keeping an eye on the tax loopholes and tax incentives that are given out to private industry and to some individuals that prevent revenue from coming in the door in the first instance. So we need to make sure that we're not giving tax giveaways to people that are very expensive in terms of the overall budget. Every dollar that we don't collect, we need to make sure in taxes, we need to make sure that that's reflecting our values too. It's not just about expenditures, it's also about revenue. And I'm going to be trying to make sure when I propose budgets to the state legislature and when budgets come across my desk after they've been adopted by the legislature, that there's not giveaways and backroom deals that don't make sense for the overall public. Tax incentives are okay. That's a legitimate tool of government, but every tax incentive needs to be balanced against, is the money that we're leaving out there, would that be better spent by collecting that revenue and making sure that we're investing in things like universal pre-K or pre-kindergarten, making sure that we've got after-school programs to take care of at-risk kids and give them help they need, making sure that we're getting the resources in the classroom to help those fourth graders learn how to read. So that's step one. Step two is I believe that we need to revisit whether or not the flat income tax was a mistake. And I think that it was. In our state, in the state of Utah, everybody across the board, except for the very, very lowest income that really don't have much income at all to pay income taxes on, everybody pays the same flat income tax rate. Whether that's a family that's just struggling to get by on $25,000 a year, or somebody that's making $25 million a year, they all pay the same marginal income tax rate. In my view, to whom more is given, a little bit more is expected. The rates should be equal for the first $25,000, but as you get to higher income tax brackets, that next dollar that you make should be taxed at a higher rate. I'm not saying that we need to go back to where we were in the Eisenhower administration, where federal marginal income tax rates were very high in the 70% range for the highest income tax brackets. But does it make sense for people who are making $1 million a year to pay a little bit more on that extra million and first dollar? I think that it does. And that's where we could generate some additional revenue to take care of the kids who are coming up in the next generation. And, I think that most very wealthy people actually would welcome that, provided that they have confidence that we have good stewardship and that those dollars are really going to take care of those children. And I'll be working like a hawk to make sure that I'm a sound steward of those taxpayer dollars, to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to take care of the kids.
Chris, one thing I wanted to ask you about, our country is going through a national conversation about racial inequities. We have seen some highly publicized public shootings of African Americans, many, if not all, unjust. Do you mind talking a little bit about how you feel about those specific instances and what you're going to do as governor to try to correct some of those wrongs?
Another great question. So first off, I think that we need to say the words Black Lives Matter. Part of the reason that I think it's important to say that is not because I'm trying to endorse every protest or every political movement, or I'm just saying the words by themselves because I need people that are Black and brown skinned out there to know that I care about them, that I value their lives, and that I do not believe in a white supremacist agenda. Because many of our many people of color in this country are starting to lose faith in the goodwill of people people who have white skin like me, and I want them to know that I care about them. That's what I mean when I say Black Lives Matter. They matter to me. My Black and brown friends and neighbors, they count and will count in my administration, and I'm going to be fighting to make sure that they get equal justice under law, and that our government continues to fight for the best version of what America was supposed to be, that more perfect union where all people are created equal. So that's the starting point in that conversation. Second, though, I do think that it's also important for us to talk about finding some reasonable police reforms. But I want to also be clear about some things that I don't believe in. I do not believe in defunding the police. I think that we need to have police forces and we need to respect law enforcement. They put their lives on the line, and many of them are struggling to do everything they can to try to keep us safe. And in the dark of the night, people need help. When a single mother is being abused by her ex-husband, she has to have somebody to call to keep her safe. And so I believe in respecting the police for that reason. But I also recognize that we need to make some changes to the way that we're engaging in policing to make sure that people feel safe, not just from criminals, but also from the police themselves. And what are some of the things that we can do? First off, we need to make sure that our cops, our police are getting the best possible training, including conflict de-escalation techniques, that we have implicit bias training. We do that at universities. We do that in business. We also need to be making sure that we're doing that in every police force across the state. And then I also think that we should be tracking to make sure that if there are police officers that are doing a particularly bad job, they're repeatedly using force in ways that's not acceptable, they can't just bounce from one police force to the other. We need a database to keep track of the police officers that are abusing the responsibility and the privilege of being a police officer. And then last, one of the things that I learned when I was visiting with the Fraternal Order of Police, the police union, is that many police officers, they go through incredibly traumatic situations. Maybe they have to go and do an investigation where there's been a murder, a homicide, and a suicide, and see those terrible images, and then they have to go right back on the job. We need to make sure that they've got the mental health counseling, anger management, and resources to make sure that the police officers are getting the care that they need so they can approach their jobs with bright eyes and an open heart and protect and serve all of us in the best way possible. So those are an example of some of the things that I'd want to focus on in trying to lift up police officers to do a better job and make sure that our communities feel like they're being protected and served in the best way possible.
So just to dive a little bit deeper on that, would you say that if that's what it, because you talk about increased training, increased like mental health help for police officers, would you say that if what it took was an increase in funding, would you say that that's what you would pursue as a governor of Utah?
Well, I hesitate to say that we need more funding for that. It strikes me that there's a good chance that we could reprioritize some of those budgets, and that's going to be different for different police forces. And also, most of the funding for police forces happens at a local level. But there is obviously the highway patrol is statewide, and that's something that we would have to look at for. Excuse me. I'm going to sneeze.
No worries.
I get allergies in the fall. Hopefully I don't have coronavirus. I don't think I do. I think it's just allergies. So I'm hoping that could be done at the same funding levels. Excuse me.
It's coming. It's coming.
Yeah. But that's something that we could entertain and something I'd want to negotiate with the police officers union and with the leadership and the various police forces across the state. I also be open if there are some local governments that don't have the resources, perhaps we could have some sort of grant program at the state level to provide some of those funding. I also don't think that this is that big of a budget item. It's not as though, this would be billions of dollars that we'd have to dedicate to make sure that we have some counseling resources available for those first responders to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. I think we could manage to accomplish that within existing budgets.
So one thing I did want to ask about, touching on mental health in Utah. Utah has historically had high suicide rates compared to the rest of the country, including among our youth. This is something that's really important to me, and I've always felt that Utah has to do a better job at addressing some of these mental health issues. How do you plan on, if you were to become governor, how would you correct some of those issues?
These are great questions. This is a good podcast. I got to tell you that I actually think that you are doing a better job interviewing than a lot of the professional people in the press, but mostly because they're in such a big hurry. They want like a couple taglines, they want to move on. You guys are doing a really thoughtful job.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thanks for giving me a chance to talk about it. So first off, I think that for youth suicide, one of the challenges that I see is that it goes back to making sure that we have the resources in place in schools that we need. One of the ways that schools around the country try to stop suicide is by having student counselors in place. We have such large schools with so few guidance counselors and teachers that are spread so thin that we have a hard time in our school system spotting kids who are struggling, maybe on the edge of dropping out of school, maybe being bullied by some of their peers, maybe stumbling into substance abuse challenges and maybe self-medicating for problems that they're facing. We need to make sure that our schools are doing everything they can to help parents at home that may not realize that there are challenges that their children are facing, and spot those, flag those students, and get them the help that they need. So that's step one, and that's going to take some resources to accomplish that. Step two, I think that we need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make sure that healthcare and mental health care is treated with parity. For a long time in our insurance industry, mental health has been treated differently than non-mental health in terms of health coverage, and I think that's a mistake. And the governor doesn't have a magic wand to wave to fix that problem. But I'm going to be working with the state legislature and also with the insurance administration to do everything that we can to find opportunities to make sure that healthcare is treated on parity with other forms of healthcare. It's, just because your disease happens to be something that's mental, whether that's substance abuse or a mental health challenge, it doesn't mean that your healthcare and health services should be less than something like heart disease or diabetes. They need to be treated equally. And I also think that it goes back to making sure that we're doing everything that we can to provide access to healthcare overall. Medicaid expansion expanded mental health care for over 100,000 Utahns across the state. That could include treatment for substance abuse. So I think that making sure we protect Medicaid expansion is an important plank in the plan to try to do more for mental health resources. One last thing I'll mention. Utah had 3 public health clinics in Ogden, Salt Lake City, and Provo. In the past budget cycle, they were about $2.5 million short on their budget. So instead of looking for creative ways to increase revenue or potentially channeling some of the coronavirus relief funds from the federal government or making sure that we just find that revenue in the general funds, the state legislature has decided, with the support of the Herbert Cox administration, to close down those low-income health clinics that were serving many people and could have been leveraged both to deal with the mental health crisis and also our coronavirus crisis. That's going in the wrong direction. We need to be expanding healthcare and leveraging the existing infrastructure we already have to reach more people who are struggling.
That's a super big issue in Utah, and the answer you gave is just awesome that you're so focused on that. I wanted to shift directions a little bit. One thing in Utah that I want to talk about is infrastructure and developing infrastructure. I attend school at BYU. I go to BYU, and it seems like every time I drive from where I live in Salt Lake down to BYU, I pass through that stretch in Lehigh and just think, oh man, like this has been under construction for 5 years. And I don't know, and maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it seems like that might be a symptom of a little bit of bloat in the government and not as efficient as it could be. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that.
So yeah, well, I have noticed that too. We sure do seem to have a trouble getting that stretch of I-15 done. So a couple of thoughts on the infrastructure. One thing that we've been pretty good at in this state is dedicating plenty of funds for road development, and that served us well in some respects, but also creates some more challenges for us in other respects. It's made it so we can get all along the Wasatch Front, quickly by and large. I think we've been a little bit slower going east to west in some areas of the state, and as our population continues to grow, we're going to have to continue to maintain and build some roads. But that being said, one of the places where we're really struggling, I think, is to make sure that we have public transportation that's meeting the growing demand. We've got the front runner running, we've got tracks in the Salt Lake Valley, but there's very little public transportation in Utah County and also in Davis County. And those are thriving areas that need more connections into Salt Lake and in their own counties. And we also should be extending that front runner train all the way up, maybe even to Brigham City, to make sure that we're that for long commutes across the entire Wasatch Front, we've got some public transportation options. As I go forward, we're going to have to invest in our transportation infrastructure. And I'm going to be continuing to do that in many of the same ways we already have. I will probably be dialing those infrastructure dollars a bit more towards facilitating, to the extent that I can, towards facilitating public transportation that has lower pollution and is maybe a little bit more equitably distributed across the state.
Sure. One thing I did want to ask you about LGBTQ rights. I wanted to just get your take. This is a very conservative religious state. I believe that most Utahns do support gay marriage. I may be wrong about that, but that's the most recent statistic I've seen. How do you plan on protecting LGBTQ rights as governor?
Sure, that's a great question. So I believe that the state of Utah is a more open and welcoming place than sometimes we get credit for. And I know that there are some challenges with different faiths, but that's true, across many different faiths, not just the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our sort of majority religion in the state. So what do I think about that as governor? I think that I'm going to be try to have an inclusive administration that makes sure that the LGBTQ plus community feels represented and protected. And I'm open to exploring additional legislation, including an expanded public accommodations law. We have a pretty good public accommodations law that prohibits discrimination in the workplace or in housing for LGBTQ citizens or Utahns. But what about in financial services, in the health insurance industry? Should somebody be discriminated against in whether or not they can get a bank account or a home mortgage loan simply because they're gay or lesbian or a member of that community? I think not. And I think that most Utahns would be willing to explore some expansions of those protections. Another thing I plan to do is make sure that the LGBTQ community is included in my administration, that they're open to, that they serve on various boards and commissions that the governor has an opportunity to appoint. I want to have the most diverse and cosmopolitan executive branch in the history of Utah, to try to signal to the world that it's a Utah for everyone, and that we can all work together to try to build a bright and prosperous future for ourselves.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. I think we're probably getting pretty close to time, but one thing I wanted to ask you about was, and we've talked a little bit about the church in the state, but expanded a little more broadly, is we've talked about in this podcast before our concerns with special interests being involved in government and how that can oftentimes not reflect the majority of constituents. I guess my question would just be, how would you combat that, or just how would you assure people that you're going to be more for the average person than any special interest?
Yeah, well, how can I assure you? Well, I'm hoping that people will take a look at my track record as a professor and as a public servant and an attorney, where I spent my entire career trying to fight for the ordinary working people of our country. Whether that was when I was at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, helping build civil law enforcement to try to make sure that banks and debt collection companies, payday loan companies don't break the law, that they speak truthfully to the public. And our team, when I was in the federal government, managed to return over just about $12 billion in refunds and restitution to people all across America. About 10% of the adult population of America got a refund or some compensation in one of the cases that we worked on while I was in the federal government. So I have a track record of looking out for the interests of ordinary working people, and that's the kind of thing that you can expect that I'll do here in the state. One of the things I'll mention though about one of the challenges that we face here in the state of Utah is that we've had a one-party government for so long that that tends to not have the checks and balances that our form of government was designed to try to keep those special interests in check. And that happens both in Democrat states and in Republican states. Back in Illinois is notorious for being a little bit of a corrupt government. Many of their governors in recent years have gone to prison. That's a Democratic state. One of the challenges that they have is that, because they win, regardless of whether or not, the Democrats almost always win there's an incentive to try to engage in that insider party politics to get ahead. And I think that we're seeing some of the same challenges with that in the Republican Party. Having a Democratic governor who's willing to, call balls and strikes, focus on the public interest, and point out when there's a bit of a challenge or when there are problems or shortcomings, that would really be, I think, change the way that government takes place in the state of Utah. So I think it would be a breath of fresh air, and that it'd actually be really good for Republicans, especially moderate Republicans, to have somebody that's outside of the party, making sure that folks inside the Republican Party are still on the straight and narrow.
Thanks, Chris. Well, we don't want to keep you too long. I know it's getting late here, so I want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for coming on and giving us an hour to talk to you and grill you. And it's refreshing to get your take, and I wish you all the best in your election.
Well, and I wish you the best in your podcast, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to speak with you guys and with your listeners. And I'm happy to come back anytime. So if I win this, we'll come back after I'm governor.
We're going to take you up on that. We're going to write that down.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.
Hey, thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.